Hello, everyone. Both live in the presence here, the thunderstorms of New York. You braved it, and all those that the comfort of their living room or dining room or whatever other comfort they may be in. Rabbi Jacobson here, another episode of Wednesday Night Live. The topic is, does life ever end? The science of immortality. So we know that from the beginning of history, human beings have always pursued the fountain of youth, trying to discover immortality. Can you live forever? The pharaohs of old, for example, we know today that when they were ready to die, their view of immortality was to have themselves buried in the pyramids in Egypt, together with their wives and children, all alive. This was for them a sense of immortality. Today we have things like cryogenic freezing. Some people freeze themselves, hopefully that one day there'll be resurrection. And you have all the different fairy tales and aspirations of living forever. So it's a fascinating topic, life and death. We all know that they're both what's the word I want to use? Both embroiled in mystery, and we don't really understand what life exactly is, what is death, and so on. We know their realities in our lives. We know the people that are close to us, loved ones, hopefully not prematurely, but then when their time comes, their body and soul separate, just as the moment when they were conceived and they joined, and that it was what we call death. But when you start thinking about it a little more, the topic is far more complicated. Today we know in the last century or two, there's laws of physics. So you probably have heard of the law of conservation of matter and the law of conservation of energy. It's been proven by scientists that nothing can be destroyed and nothing can be created. Every form of matter on Earth, every form of energy on Earth cannot be destroyed. It just changes form. So for example, if you boil water turns into gas. If you freeze water, it turns into ice. So it's true, gas you may not see with the naked eye, but you cannot say the water disappeared. It just changed form. You take wood and you burn it in a fire, it turns into fuel. And even after the wood completely disappears, besides the ash that remains, the energy that was released in the fire and the energy that fire created does not disappear. And it's been proven that exactly the amount of matter or energy, the way it was originally, remains always at the same amount, it's just in different form. So with that poses a very provocative question, and that is, what about death? Is there such a thing as really death? Or is it just a change of form? Life is a form of energy, and death is just a change of form. It's no longer the way it was in the earlier stage. Now it's in a different stage. Based on this scientific law, nothing disappears. And even though a body is buried and the body will decompose, all that turns into just another form as well. And you take into account also the soul, and the soul energy, that also doesn't disappear. So that begs the question, so if that's the case, why is it that death is such a sad and grieving experience? So hypothetically, you could argue that even though it doesn't really disappear, but for us it disappeared. My father passed away 9 years ago. And I miss him. I miss him all the time. The fact that his soul remains intact, the fact that he continues his life journey into a different place, doesn't console. It's consoling, but it still doesn't mean you can have a conversation with him. Doesn't mean I can touch him. There's a certain element of disconnect. But you could argue that disconnect is simply based on our limited perspective. So I can't see him, but maybe he can see me. Like I said before with the water, I can't see the water anymore. It's turned into gas. I can't see my father. And the same thing with all of us that grieve those that have died. We grieve because they're not in the same world and form that we would like to be able to experience with them. But to say they disappeared would also not be accurate. Is that all it is? Or is death more than that? So these questions, as I said, are very interesting and fascinating because they talk about, what makes us tick. What makes us tick? When you miss someone that has passed away, what are you really missing? You're missing their body, you're missing their personality. It's not just the body. You love the one person you love more than just for their physical container. You love them for their look in their eyes, the sparkle in the eye, their spirit, their personality, their skills, the way they look at you. There's a whole bunch of series of things that are not at all physical. It all is contained in this thing called a body. I often use the analogy, which I repeat many times, about when people ask, where does a soul go to after death? Which is really based on a very arrogant assumption. And that arrogant assumption is that we are where it's at, so we wonder, where does the soul go to? So I always use this somewhat, I guess it's a little humorous, but this imaginary dialogue between refrigerator and electricity. So the refrigerator asks the electricity, where do you go when they pull the plug? And the electricity responds to the refrigerator incredulously, what kind of nerve is that? You're a little box they just invented 100, 200 years ago to refrigerate food, and now you think you're the center of the universe. You ask me where I go? I go back to where my space was before it was contained in your little box. You may never fathom that because you're just one small little box. I go back to a place that's beyond time and space. So it's a nerve for you to ask me where I go. You're the one that's the newcomer on the scene. So basically, our perspective is based on our narrow view of things. I'm in this room, so I wonder, where did you go? But if you start broadening your horizons, you realize that existence and reality is not based on our little box. There may be a lot more. The fact that we do not see something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means you don't see it. Today, we know, for example, that this world is not a static universe. The world is alive all the time. Even an empty room where there are no human beings and no sign of life that we would call biological life is brimming with billions of subatomic particles that are energy. They're alive. As I said, they may not be biological, or they don't breathe in the way we breathe, or the heartbeats, but they're alive. There's dynamic energy. And the best proof of it today, you don't even need proof anymore. Just look at your mobile phone. Look at your television, at your radio, internet. How is it streaming in all these images? There's no wires. It's accessing the subatomic particles. It's accessing the airwaves and the light waves and the radio waves and all the different waves that are invisible to us. So right now, you're sitting on a cell phone talking to someone. What's connecting you? Something you cannot see. So someone's going to say, I don't see the waves. Yeah, but you see yourself speaking on the phone. You can see an image beaming into your television millions of miles away, thousands of miles away, instantaneously. You can watch a game being played in Brazil simultaneously, thousands of miles away, and as if it's happening in front of you. No one really understands how that works. And it's exactly the image. It's not a replica. It's not an artist's rendition. It's what's happening. So the camera is taking the image. Here right now, I'm beaming to whoever is watching out there. The camera is taking the picture. It sends signals through invisible space, invisible ways, without wires that there's no wires. And then on the receiving end, something's able to take those signals and convert them and turn them back into the image exactly, without any change. If someone would have told you this 500 years ago, you think they're crazy. You think they're like a religious fanatic that believes in primitive fantasies. Today, we use it all the time. And it just gets more. For example, how many cell phone signals can be in one room? Look, Manhattan is filled with millions of people. They're all walking on their cell phone. How come there's no interference from one cell phone to the next? It happens, but not very often. How many signals can there be? So when you know the world of subatomic particles, you know it's so microscopic. So think of it like billions of wires can all fit into one little area. If you want an example, take the human mind. How many ideas fit into your brain? The brain is only the size of the palm of a hand, a little larger. How many ideas fit into this brain that you have right here inside your skull? How big is your hard drive, so to speak? No one knows, because no one's ever run out of ideas. As much as you need, it's not like a hard drive, a computer, which is a artificial memory. This is natural memory of the brain. The brain is a very powerful tool. How many memories do you have in your brain? Conscious, unconscious, etc., etc. I'm using all this as an example that today you don't need much proof for the invisible. Everything that drives life is invisible. What we see is just the surface level. We know today that all phenomenon, all physical matter is made up of elements, which are in turn made up of molecules, which in turn made up of atoms, which in turn are made up of subatomic particles, and in turn subatomic particles, and we don't even know how far down the rabbit hole we can go. It just goes to more and more and more layers, and it wouldn't surprise anyone if you found out that there were 1,000 layers, there were 1,000,000 layers. So the mysteries of what's going on beneath the surface are far beyond those that which we know. This does not diminish science and scientific knowledge. Look, we've changed the world. Longevity of a human life is now almost double as it was in the 1930s, 20s. Medical advancements, technology, science, and so on. This is great advancements, but everyone understands with every advancement how much more there is to go. Going back, therefore, to define life and death, like using the refrigerator analogy, what do we know about life? We know the basics. We know that life constitutes a heartbeat. We know that we breathe. We know we walk and talk and so on. But you have situations where, for example, someone's trying to understand how the child is conceived. How does that happen? So a male seed fertilizes a female egg, and poof, suddenly you have the development of a child. Here we are sitting here, popping out of a mother's womb. You're alive with all your complexities and your neurosis and therapy and all a life. Can anyone explain that? Today science can try to replicate it. They try to replicate, but they still need the basic elements. Nobody can create life. That science, that skeptic scientist who is arguing with God and says, anything you do, I can do today. So God says, go ahead, show me. He says, listen, there's a garden that sprouts flowers. I'll create artificially flowers. And the scientist gathers some earth and is about to begin his experiment, and God says to him, listen, use your own earth. If you want to really use your own earth. He's using the earth that's already has these properties. So we human beings, if we're honest, should be humble in the face of the mysteries of life and death. And yet, we still analyze it. We still try to understand it. So I want to share some of the Torah thoughts on the subject, the Jewish view, which I believe when you really understand it can give us a whole new way of looking at our lives. This doesn't mean that death is not painful. As I said, it is. As I mentioned before, even if we know the soul continues on its journey, and you were able to have a glimpse of that soul that you love so much continuing its journey, yes, you may be happy for the soul, but you're not happy for yourself because you can't communicate, as I said before. But is there more to that? So I want to address all these topics. One of the reasons I'm addressing it is, number one, it's a topic on its own. It has merit. Secondly, last week's chapter we read about the secret of the red heifer, of life and death, purity and impurity. And as well as this week, in Balaam's so-called, he wanted to curse the Jews, ends up blessing them, you also have in his words the secrets of immortality, where he talks about Jewish continuity. Because let's not face it, as a nation, not as individuals, but as a nation, we have survived almost in an immortal way, like no other nation has. All the empires in history have crumbled, as large as they were. So what gives the secret to the Jewish eternity of our immortality? And finally, I'm addressing it also in honor of the tragic and horrific killings of the 3 young students in Israel, Gilad, Naphtali, and Eyal, who just 2 days ago discovered their bodies after 18 days of being kidnapped. And it's shaken up everybody for obvious reasons. First of all, any death shakes us up, but here's one especially. Students, we all identify, even the most barbarians always respected schools and students. They're not part of the war. What do you a war should be fought on the battlefield. You suddenly hear students 16 years old, 19 years old, at the prime, just beginning to grow into adults, and then just kidnapped and killed simply because they're Jewish. I mean, how could it not shake you up? And it reminds us, of course, not in the same scale, But the Nazi barbarism of just taking innocent people that did nothing to you and just killing them. So these things are very powerful. They wake us up powerfully and they disturb us. So it's an opportunity to honor them, to also speak about. So obviously their souls continue on their journey, but that doesn't take away from the pain and the loss and the tragedy and families. I mean, no parent should ever experience loss of a child. It's even hard to fathom what the person goes through. Death happens the other way around. There were those that come, the past that dies, our parents, our grandparents. But when the future dies, which is your children, that's beyond unfathomable. So I want to dedicate the class as well to them, and their families should only be consoled, and but also come away with how do Jews react to things like this. And I think when you look into the Jewish view on life and death, you'll discover unbelievable insight into the mysteries of these journeys, and also how we react to things that even if they're tragic. Look, after the Holocaust, let's be honest, if you look in history, any country, any nation that was persecuted and massacred in the way that we Jews were during the Holocaust, what's the first thing they do when they come back into power? They exact revenge. Eye for an eye. So the rule of history. You'll see any nation that was abused by another nation, as soon as they get into power, they find a way to get back and even retaliate. The Jewish people, after everything we've gone through, not just the Holocaust, but in previous generations as well, never called for war against Germany, for example. And not because many Germans may be innocent or not innocent. Remember, many were silent. Silence is a collaboration, essentially. But for a number, you don't find Jews saying, let's bomb the cafes in Germany for what they did to us. And today we have a strong army in Israel. It's not like we don't have ability to retaliate if we want to. It's not the Jewish way. We've always celebrated life, not death. Even when we had to fight a war of self-defense, it was done begrudgingly because there was no choice. Anything, if you look in the Jewish laws about war, you'll see you do everything possible not to fight a war. Even King David, who was such a holy man, fought wars. God said, because there's blood on your hands, you can't build the holy temple. Just to show you. And he was justified in his wars. It wasn't like just a warrior. Because the bottom line is blood is shed, even if it's justifiable. It's not the way of Judaism. We're not a faith of blood and death and war and conquest. It's a peaceful nation. And the whole Torah was given to bring peace to the world. It lies at the heart of Jewish thought. And if you look in your own hearts, think about it. Do you have inside of you that murderous instinct? Do we have inside of us that type of thing? Yes, we get really angry, and we'd love to wring the neck of anyone that's done what they've done. But that's not what we end up doing. We end up not ignoring it, we end up building. You ask every Holocaust survivor, and he'll say, my vengeance, my revenge. And he opens up a photo album of his children and grandchildren. Our revenge is that you want to kill us, we will proliferate and continue to grow and thrive in direct proportion of the persecution. Why? Not because we're ignoring the evil, it's because we will not become evil just because evil is done to us. We won't become our the victims do not become the perpetrators. Whatever word I'm looking for. You get the idea. Because we have a God and we have a higher calling. And again, I'm sure there are exceptions, and I'm sure there were vigilantes and so on, but it's not the general rule. The general rule is Torah Judaism is a path of peace. And you see it time and again. So we take all our grief, we take all our anger, and we channel it into some positive force. You see it of the beautiful, dignified families. Look at the dignity of how they dealt with it. They're not yelling in the streets, vengeance, the blood of the Arabs or the Muslims. You don't hear such language from them. And not because we're pushovers, or like people accuse the Jews of going like sheep to the slaughter during the Holocaust. It's because we didn't believe. When you're a good person, you fundamentally don't believe that such evil is possible. Why didn't the Jews believe in Europe that this is possible? They heard it from eyewitnesses. They just couldn't fathom. They know that if you can't do something, it's hard for you to imagine someone else can do it. If you can do it, there's no problem. Of course you imagine. If I can do it, everyone can do it. So it's a great tribute, that type of innocence. Obviously, we don't want to be naive and remain defenseless. But what lies behind this? This is the big question. What lies behind this? That no matter what is done, you still embrace life. In the Torah you'll find there's two paths I've presented to you, God says. The path of life and the path of death. You shall choose the path of life. Torah Chaim, the Torah of life. Everything's connected to the word life, life, life. Because there's something about life that the Jews mastered that does teach them the secret of immortality. So ironically, we are only a nation of 14 million people. It doesn't come close to any of the nations of the other empires. We never had with the Roman Empire, with the Persian Empire, the Babylonian, the English, the Spanish, the Egyptian. You go back all the way back. So what is it that gave a nation of so few people, with almost 2,000 years without even a land? We only have the Israel back last 60, 70, 70 years, 1948. What is it? So Bilam, the arch enemy of the Jewish people, actually figured it out. He says it. He says, Miman ofri leYankov, Misper lebnei Israel. He says, you cannot count this nation because they're like dust. Now you may think, well, dust sounds like a negative thing. No, but he means the dust in the sense that not only are they abundant like dust, but their personality is not defined by what they are. Their personality is defined by what they're not. Which means their personality is defined by this concept called bittul that I've spoken about many times. Bittul. Bittul is a selflessness. When you're dedicated to something beyond yourself, nothing can kill you. You see, things that can be killed have to be defined by something, then you can kill it. Can you kill a spirit? Can you kill a belief system? Can you kill a faith? You can't. Because it's not defined. You can kill things that are a target. You cannot kill things that are based on faith and belief. King Pharaoh of Egypt made this big mistake. He heard from his stargazers that a man would rise, his name would be Moses. A man would rise and redeem the Jewish people from the slavery that the Egyptians imposed on them. So Pharaoh had a great idea. You know what he said? Let's kill all the little boys, throw them in the river Nile, and thus they will never grow up. This man Moses, the savior, will never grow into adult. I'll kill all the boys. Brilliant idea. What was his big mistake? Thank God. Same mistake of all anti-Semites. He thought the power of the Jews is brute strength, like he projected. He has armies. Who's the real enemy? The ones that have the power, the men. The women and children could be subdued. Little did he know what actually happened. When the decree was passed, the fathers and mothers, parents, couples began to talk to each other. And the men said, let's not have children. Because we don't know if we'll have a boy, and if we have boys, he's going to kill them all. So let's stop having children until this decree is over. What did the women say? No. We were promised we will leave this godforsaken place. If we don't have children, who's going to leave this place? We'll all die here. And the Talmud discusses how the women found all kinds of ingenious ways to have children. So yes, many boys were killed, but a number were born. They went to the fields, they deceived the guards. What did Yocheved, the mother of Moses, do? Yocheved did the following. She took the child, hid him in a basket that she smeared with waterproof material. They put him at the edge of the river Nile. And the one that Pharaoh was most afraid of, well, he made it through. So Pharaoh's great plot didn't work. Because Pharaoh thought, I'm going to kill the strength. Didn't realize you can't kill faith. You can't kill that type of conviction. And that was the secret, the dust. Something you can't count, you can't kill. You can kill when you see a number of people, you see power, force. So you need more force to kill it. But how do you destroy light? How do you destroy faith? How do you destroy hope? Belief in a higher value system. That's what identified and personified the Jewish people from Abraham. That the Jewish people are not built on a nation. They're not built on a country, an empire, army, money. It's built on faith. It's built on a belief system, an ideology. Ideology that we can make this world a better place, and if we try hard enough, we'll ultimately prevail. Can you destroy such an idea? As a matter of fact, the more you try to destroy the people that believe that, the stronger the idea becomes. Because it's not the people that define the strength, it's their ideology. Which is why I once asked Elie Wiesel, who I'm friendly with, they say that during the concentration camps, Jews would often sing Ani Mamin, I believe with complete faith in God and Messiah. They would say Shema, they said Kaddish, which seems odd. They're in a place where God has forsaken them, the worst possible scenario. Why would they be thanking God? Why would they still remember even God? They should be so angry at God, as many Jews were. And the answer he gave was very simple, but very profound, that look, the Jews basically were making a statement. You can kill our bodies, but you can't kill our souls. You can kill our lives, you can take our lives, but you can't take our beliefs. And if it won't be us, it will be our children. And if it won't be our children, it will be our grandchildren. And look what happened. With all they did, decimating a third of our people, we're here standing. And the Nazis and their children are either gone or embarrassed of their lives. So who prevailed? Yes, they did kill many, and I'm not taking away from that. But they did not destroy the spirit, and we are here, maybe wounded, maybe limping, with a lot of scars, but we're here. And the ideology marches ahead. That's immortal. So when you dedicate yourself, even if you're a mortal human being of flesh and blood, but you dedicate your life to something immortal, you in some way become immortal. So it wasn't by immortality like the pharaohs of old that will preserve the body, will embalm it, or cryogenic freezing. That's the technology tricks. You are dedicated to a cause that's greater than yourself, and that cause lives on. And you pass it on to your children. That's why children are so vital in Judaism, about passing it on. So what does it really tell us about life and death? It tells us that life and death has a dimension called biological life and death. Yes, we understand that. We understand when a person is, God forbid, declared dead, it's either brain dead, heart dead, they don't breathe anymore, whatever defines death in a medical context. But you can have someone that's completely alive, medically and biologically, and be spiritually dead. You ever hear people say, I'm walking around, I feel like I'm dead, like a zombie. And you can have people who are old and frail, but their spirit is as alive as ever. That's why there's an expression, tzaddikim, righteous people, even in their deaths, they are alive. And wicked people, even in their lives, they're dead. Because what does dead and alive mean anyway? I remember once, in the Upper West Side, years ago, I was invited to speak at a shloshim. Shloshim is 30 days after the passing. So this day, it's a honor to commemorate. And I remember someone was driving me up the West Side Highway. I was thinking about, what am I going to say? And I looked out the window and I saw this big billboard, these highway billboards. And this billboard was an ad for Newport cigarettes. Yeah. And that gave me my whole speech. What was the ad? There's two beautiful faces, like the gorgeous couple, with the whitest teeth you've ever seen. And there's a box of Newport, and it says on top, alive with pleasure. And then, of course, there's a big box on the bottom that says smoking kills, or it's carbon monoxide, or destroys fetuses, whatever. Which itself is a bizarre. Here's an ad, and it has to be large enough to be able to see that warning. And still buy. Imagine someone's buying a product that says this kills you, and people buy it. It's part of the interesting twists of this country, of this modern world in which we live. But the faces are more dominant than that box warning. You never saw such white teeth. I don't think it exists. Definitely not people who smoke. And you don't see an X-ray of their lungs, but you want to be like these people. This is called alive, not just alive, with pleasure. So by the shloshim I said, that's one definition of life. It looks good. We're not even talking about the truth, it just looks good. What is the Jewish definition of life? So there's two chapters in the Torah that are actually called life. One is called Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah, and one is called Vayechi, talking about the life of Jacob. But there's something very strange when you look at those chapters. When you read it, you'd think the chapter called the life of Sarah, the chapter is going to talk about her life. No. It says, and Sarah, the life of Sarah was 127 years, and she died. And it talks about her burial and how she was grieved and mourned over and so on. Everything post-life. So why did you call a chapter the life of Sarah? There's a chapter, the previous chapter should have been the life of Sarah. Vayechi Yaakov, the same thing. The life of Jacob lived. So you'd think it's talking about his life. No, he lived 147 years and his last 17 years in Egypt, and he dies. Both names of life are a chapter about death. Why would you call a chapter about death? Life. The answer is, my friends, and that's what I use the Newport cigarettes, how do you define life? If you define life, the image, as Madison Avenue says, it's not important what happened, but what people perceive happened. And these two beautiful faces with white teeth, that definitely has been doctored, that looks like alive with pleasure, then yes, they're alive. But if you understand life as being a life of meaning, life of purpose, of people you've impacted, when do you know when a person is really alive? You want to know when. The day they're gone. How are they remembered? Who's grieving over them? There are people right now on earth that are very powerful. Company heads, wealthy, political. But what happens after they're dead? Will anyone remember them? And maybe people are actually waiting for them to disappear. There were people who terrorized the world. They were very powerful. But who wants to remember them? So their power was superficial, temporary, and mortal, just like them. But then there are people we talk about. We Jews especially, we can talk about Abraham and Sarah. Almost 4,000 years ago they lived. As if they're here right now. Because what Sarah represented did not die. So the Torah is saying, you want to know when someone's really called alive? Talk about them post their biological life. Are they remembered? Does anyone want to emulate them? And the answer is absolutely yes. So it's two different definitions. You're talking about physical life. That's defined by biology, by medicine. If you talk about spiritual life, that's defined by ideas, by faith, by hope, by things we stand. Now, so with in that context, which is also one of the reasons I'm speaking about it, because yesterday was the 3rd of Tammuz, which my mentor, the Rebbe, passed away 20 years ago yesterday. So it felt also appropriate to talk about this topic. So based on what I just said, one could ask the big question, so if that's the case, so why do we grieve? Who says death is such a bad thing? You know, since it's not biological life, physical life, the person's spirit lives on, that's something to celebrate. The answer is because Judaism is not just a religion of spirit, it's also a religion of spirit and body. God did not just want souls to continue their soulful spiritual journey. He wanted us to live in this material world and elevate this world. If you look at Judaism, as spiritual as it is, ultimately it comes down to the deed, an act, a good act, a mitzvah. And that can only be performed in this material world. And in that sense, souls are deprived. Even as they continue their journey, they're not in the box called the body. And they're not in this material world. They cannot transform, refine this world. So Judaism is really a faith of really two opposites. On one hand, yes, total belief that the spirit lives on forever. But the other side of it is that it's in this world, in this material world, that a soul can change reality. In spiritual worlds, it does not have ability to affect the material. Which, if you think about it, is an unbelievable, fascinating thing. It means your body, your hands, your arms and legs, your physical being is really tools given to you to allow your soul to change the world around you. Without the body, the soul could not have any impact on anyone. If I did not have a body, I could not be speaking now. So yes, my soul may be connected to you, but there's no way that we communicate in a very tangible sense. So the objective is, think of it like music. We all have music in our hearts, but if you had no instruments, and you had no one playing those instruments, let's say, God forbid, a person can't use his fingers at a piano, or use other parts of their body to produce the sound of an instrument, the music remains silent. The beauty is music is that it's body and soul. It's obviously the music is driven by something that's very soulful, but it manifests in a sound that all of us can hear and sing together and listen to together. So Judaism therefore grieves over the fact that the soul cannot continue the journey on the body level. So it's not just a weakness on our end that we do not identify and relate to the soul's journey, but there's a crucial and fundamental component of it is actually grounding it in the material world, the material existence, meaning connecting it to this earth, and that's where the pain is. And that's why, if you look in the Bible when it talks about life and death, there's something interesting it says. It says, had Adam and Eve not eaten from the tree of knowledge, they would have lived forever. It's only because they ate from the tree of knowledge that they experienced death. So of course the question is asked, what does that mean? How is that possible? So let me pose a question that's a little counterintuitive or provocative. If you had a source of electricity that had endless energy, should there be any reason the electricity should stop flowing into an appliance? I'll give another example. Let's say you have a cup of water. Barring evaporation, and the cup is intact, is there any reason the water should disappear? No. So the simple question is this: why then? How's it going there? Huh? Why then do we die? Since the soul is not a man-made force of energy, it's a divine force of energy. The soul is inside the body. Does the soul run out of energy? It's not like you run out of electricity or gas and then the car dies. Why should there be death? The answer is because if you puncture the cup or you somewhat weaken the appliance, it wears down, so the body can no longer contain so-called the energy of the soul. And that's what happened. Death is an aberration from a Torah perspective. There's no reason that a soul and a body should not be together forever. However, the problem is, once they ate from the tree of knowledge, which means they basically pierced, they were sinful. They did something which was not appropriate. They broke the machine. So now the electricity is fine, but if you have a light bulb that's cracked, or you have a computer that's broken, the electricity could be flowing in, but the container, the appliance, is defective. And that's what caused death. So essentially it means that if the material world was aligned with its purpose, was aligned and would be a perfect container for life forever. Now when you think about it this way, most people say, yeah, that's pretty logical. In other words, life, disease, death, and all that are aberrations that don't allow the soul's energy to continue its journey on this plane. So the soul goes off to its energy. The body no longer can contain, so the soul moves on in its journey like electricity that I mentioned before leaves the appliance. And the appliance, the box, the body is left to decompose as we place it in the earth and so on. So when you think of it this way, life and death takes on a whole different level of meaning. And it's true, that law of conservation, long before the scientists discovered it in the last century or two, Judaism always taught it. Nothing dies. Does life ever end? Answer is no. The question is, will it remain in the plane and in the form that we relate to it, or will it be in a different form? And what Judaism teaches is that you want to have both. You want life to continue on, but you want it to be in a form that we can relate to it in the material world. So so basically really when there's a death, God forbid, the sadness is not that the journey of the soul doesn't continue. That does continue. But it doesn't continue on the material plane where we have the ability. It would be like the music continues to play but without instruments that we can relate to. And that's why it's such a tragedy. So in that sense, when you think about people who've passed on, we have to remember their souls and spirits are with us. They don't go anywhere. And if you allow yourself to be spiritual, you become more sensitive to the spirituality around you. There was one of the Rebbe Rashab, was the fifth Chabad Rebbe. When he was a child, he would often play with his older brother, Rab Zalman Aaron, his name, or Hazah. And being that their father was a Rebbe, so they would play Rebbe Chassid. That's how you play. A teacher and his disciple. So once the Rebbe Rashab dressed up as a Rebbe, his brother dressed up as a disciple, came to him and said to him, Rebbe, tell me, what is a human being? What is a Jew? So he answered, a Jew is fire. So he grabbed his arm and said, if it's fire, why don't I get burned? So he said, because when fire touches fire, it doesn't get burned. Many things in life, what they call in psychology projection, is you experience if you have it within you. For example, God forbid, a blind person will say, there's no such thing as colors. We'll say, a person who can see, they say, well, there are colors, you just can't see them. Or someone can't hear music or sounds. That doesn't mean there are no sounds, it means you're not hearing them. The same thing is psychologically. If we're desensitized and callous, we're not going to sense subtle things. When you yourself are in touch and sensitive to subtlety, then you see subtlety around you. If a person, for example, suffers from low self-esteem, to the point they really loathe themselves, that's what they'll see everywhere around them. They'll look at everything with a negative eye. A person who has self-confidence and looks at things positively sees positivity around them. Now, which one's correct? It's a subjective answer. It depends what eyes you're looking at. If your lens is colored, you're going to see it with that color. So really, so much of our attitudes and perspectives shape how our lives will be. It's hard to judge oneself. But when you go to a party or you meet people, do you feel you uplift them or do you feel you drain them? Not an easy question to answer. Because no one's going to tell you, hey, by the way, every time I meet you, I feel drained. There may be some people who remind us of that. So that's the question. What do you project? What energy do you project? Do people want to be around you? Or people would rather not be around you? What does that mean? Because we project who we are. When you're in a mood or you look at yourself in a negative way, that's the energy you project. You can't control that. So the key is understanding yourself and being sensitive. So that's what I say. If you touch fire with fire, it doesn't get burned. If you touch matter with fire, matter will get burned. Soulful people see soulfulness around them. They look for it. Their eyes are attuned to seeing things that are subtle and soulful. People who are not soulful, very materialistic, will see materialism around them. People who are selfish will tell you everybody is selfish. People who are selfless will say there may be some selfish people, but there's also selflessness around. It really comes down to a lot of your own so-called standards, your own exposure. Love. Many people have given up on love or find love to be very like a double-edged sword. Why? Because their experiences of love have been that way. If you grew up in a home where your parents had, God forbid, an unloving relationship, with a lot of anger, a lot of acrimony, a lot of negativity, so that's your perception. So as you grow into an adult, you remember, love is always associated with pain. You grow up in a loving, nurturing home, that's your perspective, that's where you see it. You'll see people who love themselves in a good way, I don't mean an arrogant way, have a self-esteem, a self-respect, far easier for them to coexist and respect others. People who don't have it have very difficulty getting along with others. So this is also true about our attitude to life and death. If you feel if your life is driven by materialism, by everything that dies around you, which includes money, no money lasts, looks don't last, food doesn't last, anything material is always in a state of deterioration, state of eroding. It's eroding. Everything is busy dying. So then you look at life as basically a place of death. It's a matter of time. It's a very pessimistic and negative approach. But if you see life everywhere, and you see everything as being like spiritual, not material, and you know soulful things don't die, then you are yourself connecting to yourself to a source of life that continuously gives you life. This doesn't mean that you're in denial and don't know that people at some point die. But even then, you still see what they stood for and what their life was about. I know people, they think someone died, they think it's the end. It's all over. It's not true. It's not all over. It's sad. Because as I said, the leg of the journey now takes on a new shape and form, not in this world, of this material world. But it's not the end. I always mention that famous story with the previous Chabad Rebbe, when he was imprisoned. He was arrested in 1927 by the communists, especially the Jewish communists, the Defective, who are extremely vicious against anything religious, and they called him, the counter-revolutionary. What was counter-revolution about it? Embracing your faith was considered counter-revolutionary activity. And they tortured him, and they threatened him, but his spirit they could not break, even if they broke some of his body. To the point when one of them pointed a gun to his head and said, Rebbe, this object here, this pistol, this revolver, has changed many a mind. It's time to start cooperating. In other words, I'm the one in power here with my gun, and you're not. And stop being so obstinate. And the Rebbe, without flinching, without missing a beat, he said, this toy, that's what he called tzatzke in Yiddish, tzatzke, this toy, this plaything, can only frighten someone that has one world and many gods, but not someone who has one God and many worlds. And it wasn't a nice cliche. He was a threat of death. He could have shot him in a moment. There was no due process. And who survived? Well, the next line was that the man with the pistol, who was Jewish, by the way, said to the Rebbe, in Yiddish they were speaking, he said to the Rebbe, yes, Rebbe, we shall see who will prevail. And the Rebbe responded, yes, we will. That man ended up being killed, and the Rebbe ended up being freed, coming out of Russia and then later out of Poland and Europe, and ending up here in the United States in 1940. Interesting, who prevailed? The man with the gun or the man with the faith? Now, I know that's not always happy endings. There have been times where it didn't happen that way. But the lesson, he had no fear. You think you're going to frighten me? Of course Jews want to live. He wasn't suggesting I want to die. But you think you're going to frighten me with a little toy that can take away my physical life? I have many lives. I have spiritual life. We call it investments. We call it diversification. He didn't put his eggs in all in one basket called the material world. I have many lives, many worlds, and one God. Someone has one world, the material, and many gods, of course they'll be frightened by death, because death means the end. It's all over. No more money, no more power, no more influence, no more food, nothing physical. So the point here is not after the death of a great person is when you see that he's a spiritual person. Even when he's physically alive, his dedication is to spiritual life, not to physical things. So then when he passes away and his body is gone, that spirit continues to live on. Someone, on the other hand, who's embraced materialism as their arbiter, as their litmus test of success, when that's gone, they have nothing left. Yes, their spirit is still there, but they didn't live a life of spirit. They didn't value it. And this, my friends, is the key. This is the secret to immortality. It's not some type of some elixir or some type of drink you'll take or some fountain of youth. It's about how you live your life now. What you focus on, what is valuable. So anyone who has family knows, if they're healthy at least, that my children, my family is more important than everything on my material world. Not everyone knows that either. People get so consumed with their jobs, and you ask them what's going on, they say, well, we're building security for our children. And meanwhile, the children are suffering at home because the parents aren't there for them, because they're building security for them. What is security? Security is children knowing they have loving parents who care about them more than their jobs. I don't want to digress. The point is, it's what you embrace now is what lives on. So there's no consolation to say about these three young students and say, hey, their spirit goes on, their spirit lives on. That's beautiful. Obviously, their lives were ripped away from them at such a young age. Never know what they'll turn out to be. So it's an unbelievable tragedy of epic proportions. But it doesn't mean it's the end. It just means that we go through this very sad moment. But we know there's the three students. What do? They studied Torah. Their lives are dedicated to spirit. So there's no question that their spirit lives on. And we can do something about it. And that's why Jews, what we do is we fill those shoes. Each of us should add a little study once a week to fill the vacuum of these three students who will no longer study on this earth. Add some charity, have some love for each other. When we see such hatred, what's our response? Double and tripling love. Hitler and the Nazis showed so much hatred, looking for every Jew with stethoscopes behind walls. If we know the lengths they went to find a Jew, we have to do the exact opposite in love. Find every Jew on earth and show love, unconditional. So when you had a run-in with, so when you have a stranger, there's an opportunity. When you see hatred, we respond with love. You see darkness, you respond with light. And we celebrate Jewish pride, because they were killed simply because they were Jews. So many people's reaction would be, hey, you know what, let's stop being Jews. Let's hide the fact that we're Jews. No, the exact opposite. You kill us because we're Jews, we'll be even more Jewish. And eat that. When I go to Israel and you see the renaissance of Jewish life in Jerusalem, the streets, the tourism and so on, I'm sure there's always things you can criticize. But I think to myself how the Nazis are turning over in their graves, wherever they're boiling now. And watching this, to me, is unbelievable. That itself, forget about anything else. The mere fact, yes, we're celebrating our Judaism, and we're celebrating being Jews, and you're not going to knock us down just because you don't like us. That's how we celebrate. So it's not about just cowering in a corner and saying, hey, look what they're doing to us. That's not our approach. And we also don't respond by becoming anti-Semites, I know young Jews, men and women, who've gotten turned off by Judaism because they see all Jewish organizations are all about anti-Semitism. And one guy once told me, said to me, when I asked these organizations, what do you stand for? Well, we stand for anti-racism, anti-discrimination. So I said anti-Semitism. But what do you stand for? Give me something positive. If we had no enemies, what would you stand for? No answer. Most people don't want to embrace a movement that all it is about giving money, anti-racism. It's true we had to deal with enemies. You obviously need support, and it's true that raising fundraising is far easier when you're fighting Nazis than when you're raising money for education. People respond to enemies. Big challenge in the UJA and others today is once Israel is secure and they're not threatened, why should I give you money? Because people give money when there's an enemy. But Judaism was never about fighting enemies. That was inevitable, sad, and unwanted necessity due to the enemies. It was always a faith of love, of light, of hope, of life. That joke where they say the guy gets up in the Knesset and he says, I have the solution to all our problems. Instead of fighting with the Arabs, let's attack the United States of America. Okay? And of course, they'll beat us. And out of guilt, they'll rebuild us like they did Japan and Germany after World War II. At their expense. Okay? What do you think about that idea? And a Jew gets up, an old Jew in the back there says, yeah, very nice idea. But what happens if we win? One small problem. If you win, what are you going to do with 300 million Americans? In other words, we're very good at playing defense. We're survivors. No one survived like the Jewish people. But let's say you have no enemies and there's no one to fight, tell me, you have something to say? I speak sometimes to colleagues, to others, and I say, let's say there was no one that you thought was the enemy of the Jewish people. There was no these forces. What positive message do you have? So I understand after 2,000 years of Golos, 2,000 years of suffering, we've developed very good defense. You see in sports, there are teams that are known just for their defense. But that doesn't really work, especially for young people. They're not interested in just playing defense. I want to know what we're going to do when we're on the offense. Once we have power, what are you going to do? And that's a far greater challenge. So, to go back to the theme of life and death, you shall choose the path of life. And you find that it's unbelievably, not just dignified, but a tremendous testimony in history that a people who suffer so much did not develop, at least in most part, a negative attitude to life. It's true there are many Jews that are obsessed with guilt, especially Holocaust survivors, and negativity and anger and so on. But that's not the path of Judaism. If you look in the Torah never says that. The Torah says, Ivdu Hashem b'simcha, serve God with joy, And it says it as a rule. It doesn't say only when you're in a happy mood. So you have to work at it, or else it wouldn't be a mitzvah if it came natural. And that if you don't, because you have not served in joy, and it tells you all the maladies that will come. So people read that verse and say, "What's that? It's a strange verse." It's like telling someone with a gun to their head, if you're not going to be happy, you're going to suffer. Who's going to become happy with a gun to their head? That's what the pasuk sounds like. But it's not true. If you really read the Torah, the Shalosh says that there are two opinions of what means reward and punishment in Judaism. Schar and einish. Actually, reward and punishment are not accurate translations. And he says the consensus is that it's cause and effect. Siba mesubov. When you put your hand in fire and the fire burns your hand, that's not a punishment. That's how the world was created. There are consequences of behavior. What the Torah is saying, not if you're not joyful, this is going to happen to you, it's some threat. It's inevitable. An unhappy person brings unhappiness into their lives. It's an attitude. It's a projection, what I said before. When the little boy said, "What's a Jew?" He said, "A Jew is fire." So his brother grabbed his hand and said, "If you're fire, how come I don't get burned when I grab your hand?" She said, "Because when fire touches fire, it doesn't get burned." Souls don't burn each other. When a body tries to appreciate subtlety, it's going to have a problem. So it's all kamayim aponim laponim, which means as a face is reflected in water, so too a heart is reflected in another. A loving person elicits love. Now, of course, there are monsters in this world, as we've seen this past week and unfortunately many times. But generally speaking, a person that's a human being responds to something that's heartfelt, because we have that within us. It's like if you don't have the antenna, you're not going to appreciate those signals. So when we're faced with things of death, even in the most tragic circumstances, like we saw this week, or I mentioned the Holocaust, yes, this does not diminish our pain and grief and all that. But at the end of the day, what we embrace is spiritual life that lives on forever. Atem hadvekim b'Hashem Elokeichem chayim kol chamayim, which means, in simple English, when you cleave, you cling, you connect to something that is immortal, you also become an extension of immortality. It simply comes down to what you live your life for. If you place all your bets on materialism, you'll go down with it, because that's your source of security. I always found it ironic. They call it securities exchange, etc. Security. Prudential has the rock, is their logo, the rock. But this type of securities, if you're only as secure as the foundations you hold on to. If everything in this material world deteriorates, erodes, dies, decays, and you hold on to that as your security, what do you think you're going to have? Oyev kesef layizbe kesef. The more you love it, the more you want it, because you know deep in your mind that it doesn't last. So the only thing you can do is try to accumulate more and more. You hoard. The happiest people in this world, happy with spirit, with faith, with their belief system, their ideology, they've connected to something that can't be killed. So you can imagine what kind of security that gives you. And this is nice theory on paper. The Jewish people embody what I just said. Am Yisrael Chai, that we actually are here thousands of years later. Why? Because we passed on and we inherited big money from our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. I'd like to see that. If there's any wealth among Jews, it's maybe a few generations old, maximum. Maybe Rothschild is the only one that... but it definitely doesn't go back to the time of Moses. The Jews came out of Egypt, they were very wealthy. That wealth has long ago dissipated. The Gemara in Pesachim talks about how that wealth was transferred to other empires. Until today it sits in Rome, is what the Talmud says. So what gave us our ongoing, what did we have? We had a power that cannot be killed because it was never born. It's not defined by material parameters. And that is, whether it's faith, whether it's betachon, hope, it's ideology, it's something you hold on to that can never be killed. And when a person lives by that, when you say it's tzaddikim, in Tanya, Balak-July says some unbelievable statement when he explains why tzaddikim, even in their deaths, they're called alive. Shavik chayim l'chol chay, he says. Which is an interesting expression. They've returned life, they've given their life to the living. What does that mean? So usually interpreted when a person passes away, what remains is the living on earth remain with his memory or something. So he interprets it the following, from based on the Zohar, that a tzaddik, ishtakich yater, he's more present after his death than he is during his lifetime. The Zohar says that because in his lifetime he's inside of a body. And now all you have is a spirit which is everywhere. What does he say? He says, Chayit tzaddik, the life of a tzaddik, of a righteous person, true righteous person, who lives his entire life selflessly for the good of others, for what he calls is Chaim Ruchnim. That's what he says. The true life of a tzaddik is spiritual life, not after he dies, while he's alive. It's not Loi Chaim Psarim, not life of flesh, but life of spirit. He says what? Yiras Hashem, Amunah, and Ava. Awe of God, love of God, faith and love of God. And of course includes love of other persons. So if a person lives 24/7 like that, what happens to them when their body dies? Their physical body stops. But that was never there. That was not what their lives were about anyway. Because the things that they embodied, that they embraced, were always eternal. So therefore, eternity, tzadikim gam b'chayim, gam b'misosam kruyim chayim. Whereas a wicked person, what did he embrace in this world? His selfish needs, self-interest, material things, whatever gave him or her satisfaction, instant gratification. So what happens? When that's gone, he's gone too. Because even while it's alive, it's dead. What does it mean dead? In halacha, in Jewish law, it says, we call something mayim chayim. This week's chapter, well, last week's chapter, mayim chayim. Mayim chayim means live water. There's certain impurities that can only be purified through a live spring. We know about a mikveh. A mikveh, technically, is a body of still water, rainwater that is captured in a certain area, and it's used. Most mikvahs, are that type of mikvah. But there are mikvahs. For example, you go to Tzfat, the mikvah of the Arizal there is a live spring. Besides being freezing, it's also connected. It's constantly running. It's connected to a spring under the ground. Certain impurities require that for purification, mayim chayim. So the Mishnah asked the question, what defines a live spring? What defines chayim? Life. So it says a spring that is alive at least for 7 years. If, for example, you see a spring, but you don't know if it actually was running for 7 years, you cannot call it live because it may still die tomorrow, in a year. 7 years, without getting into the details, is considered a lifetime because 7 is the cycle. If it lasts 7 years, like a yovel, it's a type of yovel is called La'ilam, forever, because it's a period of time that you have the chazakah, the so-called, you can assume that it's going to go on. So here's the interesting thing. Someone will say, why? Right now it's live. It's connected to its source. It's running water from a live spring. Why do you worry about what's going to happen tomorrow or 6 years from now? The answer is based on a basic concept. If something's going to die tomorrow, it's already dying now. It doesn't die at the end, it's already dying. The Bachaya writes, great commentary, he writes, the Tinuk Mishanelad Maschil Yisyavish. A child from birth is already beginning physically to erode, to age. I know that's depressing for us that are not children anymore. Because when do you begin to age? You could say when age is visible is when you get your first wrinkle or gray hair or lose your hair or whatever it is. We can all, I'm sure nobody's here younger. You're all so young so you don't know these issues. One day you'll come to understand. Okay. But the truth, that's not the case. Physicality begins to erode the moment it's born. It just takes time. Because you can't be age 80 if you weren't first age 10. If you weren't 1 year old, you can't become 2 years old. So it's interesting insight. So that's why it's not called Mayim Chaim, because even if it dies in a few years from now, even now you can't call it Chaim. On the other hand, something that's connected to life, so even right now it may look material, but it's connected to something that is spiritual, something that lives on, so it too has in it an element of eternity. So it comes down to a simple equation. What are we going to dedicate our lives to? When you dedicate your life to material gain and success, so that's, you can do maybe great things, but it's all going to come to a limit. Everything has a limit. If you dedicate your life to spirit, to activities that are beyond the here and now, then you yourself become a channel, an extension of that eternity. And that, my friends, is the ultimate story about life and death. So does life ever end? The answer is no. But our perception and what we embrace can very much end. As they say, if you're not busy being born, you're busy dying. When you hear tragedy that what happened in Israel this week, and hits home because it's students, young, for no reason at all, they were simply kidnapped. They were hitchhiking. So it hits home because you see, just simply because they were Jewish, they weren't in a path of war or battle. So ultimately, together with the grief, as I mentioned, comes down to embracing what they stood for. They were students, Torah students. That's how we honor them. We honor them by doing what they would be doing right now, which is a life of spirit. And that's the greatest way you can honor a lost. It's fine to say a prayer, to feel sad, console, but always translate it into a positive action. That has always been the Jewish way. When Abraham buried Sarah, it wasn't just burying Sarah. It was about perpetuating her memory, perpetuating what she stood for. What happens when Isaac meets Rebekah? How does he know that this is going to be his future wife? As opposed to what we usually hear these days. He says, look, she reminds me of my mother. Most people say, anyone reminds me of my mother, I'll never marry. And he says, it reminds me of my mother. What reminded him? 3 things. When he brought her into the tent, it was like his mother's tent. What were the 3 things? Ner Dolok Merev Shabbos. He saw a flame. He saw a light that burned all week. Candle. Just like his mother lit candles, she lit candles. Physically and probably spiritually as well. Second thing was Bracha Mitzvah Be'isa. There was a blessing in her dough. Literally can be a good cook. But it was more than that. There was a blessing in everything she touched. And the third thing was Anon, a cloud. Dignity, glory, dignity surrounded her, a type of aura, which some identify with Taras Mishpacha. You have the 3 mitzvahs, Rosh Hashanah Chana or Hachein, Hadlokas Neres Chana, Chala Nida. So the third thing is a sanctity about her, a modesty, a dignity, because that's how you see how it lives on. And that doesn't die. So, I mentioned my father, and others, hopefully all of you have parents, but if you think of someone you love who's physically not here, what you embrace is those qualities, those virtues that don't die. They become examples for us, and hopefully we follow that example, we live it. So when someone sees you, they see your parent. I'm talking for the positive. If someone sees you, they see your grandparent, they see your ancestor. So when people are ripped away from us, whether it was the Holocaust or this week, the 3 boys, our responsibility doubles and triples to fill the void. The expression we say when we console a mourner is Hamokim Yinachem Eschem, B'seich Sharav Litzin Yerushalayim. Hamokim, which refers to God, should console you together with the rest of the mourners of Jerusalem and Zion. Zion and Jerusalem. Question is asked, why does it say Hamokim? I mean, there are many words for God. You could say HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem. There's a whole list. Hamokim, because Hamokim signifies the key challenge of death. The space is empty. The chair is empty of the person that is no longer here, physically. So you say Hamokim, you Hashem, was called space. Fill that space. Console and fill that space. You fill the space by identifying the personality of the person, and then the space is filled because that personality continues on, even if the physical chair may be empty. So to conclude, we talk about life and death. There still remains a mystery. There's still sadness involved. Death is an aberration, because the journey we want is not just a spiritual journey. We want the journey right here on earth together with us. So we want our family members and loved ones, tzaddikim, whoever it may be, to be here not just spiritually but also materially. Because Judaism, though it's a spiritual religion, but it's spirituality channeled into a material world. God didn't just say, build me a temple, a spiritual temple in your heart. He said, build me a temple out of kesef, zav, necheshes, out of gold, silver, copper. This is one of the ultimate, I call it beauties and paradoxes of Judaism. As opposed to other schools of mysticism, you can achieve more in Judaism through a deed than through meditation. So it's really bridging two extremes. The ultimate of spirit with the ultimate of of matter. Ultimate of energy in a world of matter. And you'll see this when you study Judaism across the board, the entire spectrum. You see Hamaisu Iker, the deed is paramount, but it's all rooted in places that are very deeply spiritual and very deeply ethereal. Judaism does not last. You see, we don't have no Beis HaMikdash today. The physical temple is not here, but the spiritual temple is here. Whether it's the offerings that are represented by prayers, whether it's Shchanti B'Seichem, B'Seich Kol Echad, that God rests inside our hearts. So we want the physical, which is why we pray for a physical temple. But it's not because the physical is what we worship. It's the spirit manifesting inside of a body. That's what life is about. Life is spirit grounded in a material world. To put it more poetically, is that to have your head up in the clouds, but your feet firmly planted on the ground. You have people that their head is on the ground, or others that their feet are in heaven. And it's not the way it works. You know, the Rebbe Rashab once told a former student of his who became a big galoshes manufacturer, became very wealthy. So he said, "Fis in galoshen aber gesehen, aber a Kopf in galoshen." I've seen feet in galoshes, but I've never seen a head in galoshes. Because his business, his whole head, his mind, and everything was so immersed in the business. On the other hand, feet have to be in the galoshes. You need to be grounded on earth, but your eyes turned upward. So I want to wish, first of all, the parents and families of these three boys, Gilad, Naphtali, and Eyal, that they should only have simchas and they should find strength. Hamokim, God's space should fill their space. And the fact that it's created such an awakening by so many Jews of all persuasions is beautiful to see, in the sense of a unity that transcends denominations and levels of commitment, etc. So we have to definitely capitalize on that in the form of unity. And ultimately, all negative things have to be turned into positive action. So, though I can't say I exhausted the topic of life and death in the fullest sense, but back to the law of conservation of matter and the law of conservation of energy that I mentioned, that nothing can be destroyed and nothing can be created, meaning in this world, all energy will just change form, it will never disappear, and all matter will also change form and not disappear. This is preceded long ago by the Torah by saying that exactly that. Life does not end. It may change form, but it doesn't end. What we want is a fusion of body and soul, of matter and spirit, that it should all be together. So we should only celebrate joyous occasions. Until next week, everyone should have a very living, chayim-filled, a life-filled week, but not just material life, spiritual life. And we will continue next Wednesday. I believe Philip is giving his class tomorrow night, and if you haven't given us your email address, please do so. And any other way that we can help you in your life-affirming mission, feel free to call upon me and anyone in the Meaningful Life Center. Thank you.